A bias binding is something that I certainly use an awful lot in my sewing projects. You'll use it if you're a quilter, you'll use it in dressmaking and tailoring, and the beauty of bias tape is that it gives you a really nice professional finish to your work, and it'll go around curves as well. So if you want to wear, it's things like this. The little bags that I make, if it's a placemat, if it's a sewing machine bag, if it's bunting even, it gives you that really nice contrast of trim around the edge of your hem. It'll go around a curve, which can be very difficult if you're going to hem in that respect. And it'll sew over lots of layers of fabric as well, like with things like my pot holder. You've got an outer layer, a lining layer, and then wadding in the centre. So if I was to try and hem this regularly, I'd fold it over once, I'd fold it over twice, then I've got a big bulky hem that won't go underneath my sewing machine and looks quite ugly, and I'd never get that perfectly round. So this is where bias tape really comes into its own. For finishing touches on things like your glasses case, on a pair of slippers, pockets on your sewing machine bag, bunting it's brilliant for, because your bunting looks just as good on the back as it does from the front. Finishing off pockets and trim around aprons, on your handbags you'll use it. You'll use bias tape to encompass piping, and that can be on your cushions, around your cushion covers, even on things like Roman blinds. I've got my peg bag, more handbags, the little bag that you may have seen the tutorial on YouTube for, all again finished off with bias tape. Now it's very simple to make yourself. You can buy it, it's more affordable to make it yourself, and of course you can choose the fabric that you're going to use as well. And the way that it works, if you want to wear, a fabric normally, a woven fabric, has a weave going across that way and a weave going up that way. So it doesn't really move, it doesn't stretch, it's not supposed to. But when you cut on the diagonal at a 45-degree angle, the bias, then you get that kind of scissor motion. So therefore your fabric is going to stretch, and that means that you can take it around curves, you can take it around in circles without it puckering, and again it gives that really nice, neat, professional finish. So first of all, let's take a look at the tools that you're going to need to cut your bias. So you need a self-healing cutting mat. The bigger the better. This one actually measures 24 inches by 17 inches. I'd say that's the smallest that you'll actually need if you're going to be doing a lot of cutting. This one has inches on the one side, it's got centimetres on the reverse side, so you're probably going to use the inches side more. And the markings on here will give you the 45-degree angle that you need to cut at, but you've also got 60 degrees and 30 degrees for other projects as well. The rotary cutter that I use, it's an alpha, the same as the cutting mat, 45mm as the size of the blade, and that's the most popular size used. So there are different sizes. If you don't know which one to buy, go for the 45mm. And then you'll need your rectangular ruler. This one again, I just prefer alpha ones. In inches, it's got 1/8 of an inch markings on here as well. But again, you've got your 45-degree angle, which is what you're going to need for your bias tape. Now we've got two ways of measuring and cutting this. You can either use the guideline on the ruler, or you can use the guideline on the mat, or both. So we'll have a look at both ways. So first thing I need to do is to lay my fabric on my mat and work out which way around this is going to go. Now if you've got a selvage on your fabric, you know that that's going to be the straight edge, so you can line this up against any of the grids or the base of your mat. The 45-degree mark is this one that goes all the way across the mat that way. So I'll need to cut a corner off my fabric, so I can measure from one side to the other all the way down the line, that 45-degree line, and just chop straight across. You'll only need to do that and measure it once. Or you can use the 45-degree mark on the ruler, in which case I need to flip that over and it will be here. And as long as I know that that's my straight edge, I lay the 45-degree mark on the ruler onto the side of the fabric, and then I can cut across the corner this way. I'm going to use the markings on the mat for this instance. So again, just making sure that the selvage or the edge of my fabric, the straight side, is lined up against one part of the grid. Lay my ruler across, directly on top of that 45-degree line, and then cut. I need 1-inch bias tape, so I'll need to cut the fabric 2 inches in width, because the bias tape's folded over in half so the two sides meet in the centre. So what I'll do now is to flip my fabric over. I don't need to use the gauge on the mat anymore. I'm going to use the measurement on the ruler and line this up against the edge of the bias cut that I've just made, 2 inches across. and cut. Then I'll carry on doing this until I've got as much bias tape as I actually need. I'll show you how to join it together in just a second. Now when you come to a length of fabric that's too big for your ruler and your cutting mat, and we're heading towards that way right now, see, that part's too long now. Make sure that this line's kept straight. You can fold your fabric in half, line up the two edges that you've just cut, and then cut your 2-inch strip again here. And you can carry on doing that. Probably, if you've got a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter, until you've got about 6 layers of fabric. So we'll cut a few more strips because I'm going to show you how to join together, how not to join together, how to sew these around in a circle, and then I'll show you how to sew some mitered corners as well. So one more strip should be enough. Just to help, if you have a fabric that's a little bit fine, you can use some spray starch, and it just gives that little bit of firmness to the fabric. So give it a quick spray, iron it, and just make sure it's nice and dry before you start cutting. So that's all my strips cut. Just need to go and pop the iron on. Now before we fold, we need to join the pieces together. Just make sure that if you have any selvages on your fabric that you trim those away. Do that with your rotary cutter. I've just popped mine away. So no selvages. Now when you join the pieces together, it looks obvious that that lines up with that. So you need to join across here. So you'd put those two pieces face together, line up the hem, and then sew, using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that's what seems right, but then when you open up your bias tape, it's not matching. So the way to do this is to take one piece, there's my next piece. So that's kind of how I want to join them together. Turn it over face down and then lay the two pieces out into a cross shape like so, making sure that there's a right angle and that one's a right angle. Now if you want to pin that, that's fine. For speed's sake I shan't, but I'm going to sew from that diagonal line across to that diagonally from that corner to that corner, sorry, in a diagonal line. Okay, so keeping that nice and square. You can mark that or just fold it over to crease to make it a nice straight line if it's easier for you. And then when I open up the two pieces, the edges match. So you will need to trim away the excess here and cut it to around about 1/8 of an inch from the seam line, and then before we take this through to the iron, you need to press that open. And if it's a woven cotton fabric like this, you should be able to do that just with your fingers. And I'll just trim off the extra pointy bits of the seam and the thread. And there you have the perfect join. So join all of the pieces together that you need to first of all, then we'll take that to the iron and the tool to fold it over. So this is what you want your bias tape to actually look like. Both edges of the tape are folded into the centre and then pressed. There's a few different ways that you can do that. I find the easiest ones and the cheapest one is just to use one of these little tools. Now I'm using a Clover mini iron. You can of course use your big regular iron if you wanted to. This is just because I don't have much space here. With the tool you'll thread your fabric through. Make sure that your seams, if you have any, are facing upwards.
thread your fabric through the bottom of the tool and pull it through, and you'll see already when you arrange it that it's starting to fold the fabric in half. That's so. So just catch it on the end with your iron to get it going. And then very slowly just pull the tool along and press as you're going. You can help that with your fingers if you like. But you just need to make sure that both of those edges are meeting in the centre. If you are using this with your regular steam iron, just be aware that if you're steaming your fabric, this tool will get hot because it's metal. And of course if you don't have a tool, you can do this by hand. It's just a little bit more time consuming to get that accurate. And it's important that it is accurate because when this is folded over onto my work, I want both halves, if you like, because that'll be folded over like so. I want that to be parallel, I want it to be a straight line. So this may be a little bit time consuming, but it's worth the time and the effort. And you could always make your bias tape in batches. So if it's a colour that you know you're going to use a lot, I use a lot of red, then while I'm in the mood I can just make yards and yards and yards of this and roll it up and save it. Okay, so that's how we do it. If you don't have the tool, you can do this by hand, but again it's just a little bit more time consuming to get that accurate, and remember to watch out for your fingers because these irons do get hot. So this is how I'm going to attach the bias tape around a curve. This could be a placemat or a pot holder, and basically I've got my top fabric wadding in the centre and then my base fabric underneath. I'm going to cut the end of the bias tape so that it's straight, and then just fold that under by about 1/4 of an inch and crease that with my fingers. Then I'm going to start pinning with the raw edges together. Remember, this is the right side of my work, and I put the pins across and pin that all the way around edge to edge. Now just for speed's sake I'm not going to pin all the way around here. You get the idea. So with a straight stitch I'm going to sew in that crease line all the way around. So following the curve, I don't have a problem with pins, but if you want to take those out as you go, that's fine. Try and stop with your needle in the down position, and then just gently keep your eye on that crease mark and ease that fabric around. This is where bias tape really comes into its own, because it's cut on the bias. You can stretch it a little bit. If that was a straight woven fabric you wouldn't be able to bend it like this. Just make sure there's no puckers. If it starts to get a little bit creased underneath the foot, you will see that on the outside of your work. So just make sure you keep stretching that and moving it and keeping in that crease line. Now sometimes when I'm sewing with wadding, and I make a lot of bags, placemats, things like that that have wadding inside them, you can tend to find that it grows a little bit or it moves as you're sewing. A walking foot would help. But there's nothing wrong with trimming away any excess fabric after you finish this stage of applying the bias tape. I'll show you that in just a second. But we're coming back to the beginning again. I like my bias tape too long, so I don't measure it exactly. I'll always have that little bit extra because I find that it's so much easier to be able to cut the tape down than it is to try and join it together once you've started your work. So you can see where I started sewing the tape on. I'm going to overlap that by around about 1/2 inch and cut my bias tape off straight, and then still follow the line that I'm sewing around until I get to the point, that can be shorter actually, where the two pieces meet, and these should overlap, but I need to make sure that the crease line matches up So my stitches will meet where they left off. Like so. Now if you do have any excess fabric at this point, you can trim that back if it makes it easier. You won't see what's going on the inside of here, so whatever makes it neater and easier. Fold your tape over. Now it may look as though it's going to pucker a little bit, but when this is pressed, when it's finished, and you've stretched this into place, it will sit perfectly flat. You can see that starting already. So I like to sew by hand. Actually, you see where my stitch line didn't quite meet up there? That's not good enough. I'm going to put that back under the machine and just go over that section so it's perfect. It doesn't always happen to be perfect first time, but you can rectify that. So I just missed that's it. I just missed the start of my stitching when I came around. It's better. So turn that over to the back, take away my loose threads. And then I'm going to fold the bias tape over. Now I don't want to see any of this stitching, so I'll just make sure that that folds over enough to cover it, and then I'm going to use a slip stitch. Use the same colour thread as your fabric so you don't see it. I'm just using red so that you'll be able to see a little bit more what I'm doing. I like the end of my thread to disappear into my work, and then I'll just go over the top of the same stitch a couple of times to secure it. It's easier than tying a knot and it's not bulky. Then I'm going to fold my fabric over and catch a tiny little bit of that folded edge, and then go into the fabric directly underneath. Go across about 1/4 of an inch and catch into that again. This is a slip stitch. The smaller you do the stitches and make sure that they're as even as you can make them, the neater it's going to look and the more professional finish you're going to get. And I'd simply do this all the way around. I'm just going to show you as I go over the join as well, which I'm just coming up to. Just making sure that again those stitches are covered up, like so. And I'm not taking the needle all the way through to the front side because I don't want to see my hand stitching on the front of the fabric. When I come to the join, that was my folded section where I started. I'm going to fold that straight over. I'm going to tuck in any loose edges and sew straight across. Now for a wider tape, this is a 1-inch bias tape. You could sew this bit as well using a slip stitch or a ladder stitch, but seriously it's not going to come undone. It's not going to fray. So I don't really see the need for that, but if you really want it to look very, very neat and professional, then you'd sew that after you finish going all the way around. So again, just keep folding and stitching, tucking in your loose threads, keeping these stitches as small as you can until you finish the complete circle. Okay, so I'll finish that later on. The second way of applying your bias tape is to do it purely by machine. So I'll just show you on a straight piece here. If I'm going to sew both sides by machine, the check side, remember, is my top side. I'm going to start sewing this time from the back side. So pin it again if you wanted to, but just like before, I'm opening up the tape. I'm going to sew across the ironed mark. Works the same if you're sewing around a curve or if you're sewing on a straight line. So this could maybe be the edge of a pocket or the top of a bag. But if I don't have the patience or the inclination or the ability to sew all the way around by hand, this may be a large project, it could be a table runner, and this is the way that I do it by machine. So that's now the wrong side of my fabric, and the reason I've done it this way is because machine stitches are going to be seen from the front side. So just like before, I'd fold that side over. I'm going to pin it this time. So that the stitches are covered up that I've just made. And then we'll top stitch on the machine. And if you wanted to, you could use a decorative stitch if you've got maybe some embroidery stitches on your machine, or a zigzag stitch maybe, because these stitches are going to be seen even if they're in the same colour as your fabric. I'm going to make the stitches a little bit longer. No reason, I just like the look of the longer stitch. And this time top stitch. Now I'm going to sew on top of my bias tape, and that's about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm just trying to keep that really neat and in a straight line, because again you will see these stitches, so the neater the better. And the reason I'm doing it back to front like this is because I'm now in control of those stitches and I can see that they're nice and neat. The stitches from the back side, no matter how hard I try, are never going to be as neat as the ones that I'm looking at here. But on the reverse side of, say, a pocket, you won't see those anyway. If this is the underside of a table runner, nobody's going to turn that over to see what it looks like from the back. Okay, so that is now the front of my work. So again, that nice, neat, straight line. And that's the back of my work. Not quite as straight, nobody's going to see it. That's the important bit. So that's machine sewing on your bias tape. The final thing I wanted to show you was how to do mitered corners. So, as usual, we'll open up the tape. Never start sewing your tape on in the corner. Fold over the edge. Pin if you want to. And we're going to sew up to 1/4 of an inch from the corner here. If you want to measure and mark that, then you can do. So sewing in that crease line again, up to 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and I'm just gauging that from the edge of my fabric that I can see here. And then I'm going to reverse backwards a few stitches, lift my needle up and stop and come away. And this is important, because now you're going to take your fabric, open it up, and fold it into that corner to make a right angled triangle like so. So you pinch the fabric here and then carry on sewing down the second side of that line. And then you'd repeat that on the other corners. So when I turn my fabric over, I get a nice sharp corner. Now I did have a question on one of my previous tutorials about what happens on the other side. So I'll show you. So I'll just take my needle and thread, pop this over, cut away the loose threads because that makes it neater and easier to sew. So just like previous, I like to start away from my work. I'm just going to show you around the corner here, so obviously I'm not sewing all the way around, and hide any knots underneath the bias tape. Catch that again. That's the way I'd finish off the stitching as well. Just go over and over in an inconspicuous place and fold my tape over. So I'll just rush this a little bit so I can get up to the corner to show you. About 1/4 of an inch apart I think is fine for the stitches. Again, slip stitches are very quick to sew by hand, and normally this would be on the back of your work, so it's nice to have your work nice and neat and perfect, but if it's not the end of the world, because it probably won't be seen. So just coming up to that corner, remember how neatly that folded from the right side? I'm going to sew again, loose thread, right up to that corner section. So I've kept the edge of the bias tape in a straight line covering over the stitches into the corner. And I'm just going to secure that with another little stitch before I turn my work around and fold the second side over, so I've made that nice sharp point. So again, sewn up to the corner here, you can see the shape taking form. Fold into the corner, it's a bit like gift wrapping. And then I'd put another stitch right in that corner to hold it. Now if you were going to be really precise, you could, after you've finished, put a little ladder stitch into both of the seams there. Again, the smaller the better, and a ladder stitch just going in one side, tiny amounts of thread, fabric, sorry. And then pull that tight, and that'll be nice and secure, and your seam should lay flat. Okay, I would normally do that after I finish, not at this stage. And then carry on around the corner until you've finished sewing all the way around. So you get the gist. So when my corner's finished, that's the inside and that's the outside. So nice and neat, oops, and sharp. Now if you're going to sew this by machine, I do just the same as before. I do it the other way around, so that this would be the front side of my work. Turn that over, sorry, this is the front side of my work, turn it over and then top stitch, but pin all of this in place beforehand so that you know that you're going to machine stitch into the corner. And if you wanted to hand tack that first before you machine sewed it, then you know that you're going to get that perfect finish.